Hi everyone, it's Guillaume from Startup Basecamp. Welcome to the Tech for Climate podcast. During the show, you will have the opportunity to meet the best climate tech founders, investors, and experts from both Silicon Valley and around the globe. They will share with you their stories and personal journeys into this growing and exciting industry, giving you some insight into the ecosystems that help you to take part in the fight against climate change and benefit from the opportunities it can represent. The podcast is divided in two small interviews. So in the first part, you will get to know our speakers, their perspectives on the climate crisis and how climate tech is changing the game. The second part of the discussion will be for members of our community who will learn the speakers' secret sauce on how to and share with you their unique expertise on topics such as fundraising, management, strategy, and so on, to help you to become a better leader in your field. So before we start, I would like to quickly share what we are doing at Startup Basecamp to support climate tech founders in accessing resources and gaining visibility with investors they seek. Our initiatives include a membership-based community platform offering access to a dedicated Slack group with a growing number of founders, experts, and investors from around the world, and a series of exclusive content such as interviews, weekly job listings, events, and our quarterly online pitch of night opportunity. But more than a place where you can learn, exchange, and grow, we are building a matchmaking service to facilitate connections between our members and top investors and experts in the field. And soon, alongside with other top investors, we will be launching a small fund to co-invest in the growth and acceleration of our members. Finally, all of this is possible because of your support and donations. We are a small self-funded team, and we want you to be part of this collective movement against climate change. So please share one episode with a friend and subscribe to the channels. As an added bonus, we will plant a tree for each of our subscribers each time we reach 1,000 new fans or donors. Do not hesitate to connect with me via social media or email guillaume@startupbasecamp. Thanks a lot for listening. I hope to get in touch with you soon. And now, let's go for the show. Hi everyone, during this new episode of Founder Series, we are sitting down with Cody Finke, co-founder and CEO of Brimstone Energy. Brimstone Energy creates the world's first carbon-negative Portland cement without changing the product or the price. Brimstone has developed a cement formula that has successfully removed cement-making process emissions and yet is scalable and cost-effective. I was excited to speak with Cody, a nature lover who began his career as a chemist working developing wastewater treatment technology at Caltech before realizing that if he wanted to make an impactful change, he needed to start a business to sell new technologies able to tackle environmental problems. He therefore went in pursuit of finding a solution to the lesser-known environmental pollutants and settled on cement. Currently a big challenge with great potential climate impact, since cement production currently contributes to roughly 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. In this episode, we will learn more about the often overlooked cement industry, who the big players are, what gaps Cody discovered in the market, and how tackling the carbon emissions from cement production can have a big impact on climate goals. Cody then goes into the details of cement production and how he plans to scale his cement process and promote his solution as the only one that tackles cement process emissions. Cody then gives us an overview of the biggest challenges in the market and what the main opportunities and risks of his business model are. During the second part of the discussion, Cody will give his secret sauce for early stage founders looking to fundraise by giving his tips based on his last successful funding round of $55 million USD. Finally, he will share how he has managed to maintain a good work-life balance as a busy CEO and some of the books he found useful. Cody, welcome to the show.
Hi, Cody. Welcome to the Tech for Climate podcast. I'm super happy to have you here with us today. I believe it's going to be a great opportunity to hear your story and learn more about what you're up to with Brimstone Energy. It sounds that a lot is happening, as you guys made the news very recently announcing a 50 million fundraising round. So, congrats. I'm sure there's a lot to share, and I can't wait as I have a ton of questions for you. So, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks very much, Guillaume. I'm very happy to be here.
So before we start, can we give us a 30-second intro about Brimstone Energy?
Yeah, very quickly. So, the purpose of Brimstone is to decarbonize the world's cement industry. So, cement is responsible for about 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is about the same as cars. Cars are 6.5%. And yeah, that's good enough, probably.
So let's start from the top, and I'm sure we're gonna go deeper into all of that. But let's start from the top, as I we always like to do. It's like kind of like putting back the speaker into the center of the interview as a human. So tell us a bit more about your personal story and background. I mean, what are you passionate about? What do you do or love to do besides building, Brimstone? And what makes you feel inspired, like your best self? As I always ask, like, who's Cody?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, I think I got into or I got inspired to do the work that I'm doing through a lot of different ways, I think. You know, one way is, I felt very lucky, as, growing up in the United States, and growing up in Seattle, and having parents who could pay for my education. It's sort of a rare thing, in the world, and even a rare thing in the United States. And, I felt very lucky. And like through that education, I got the chance to, travel quite a bit, and go to, places where there's a lot more poverty and human and environmental suffering. And I felt like I wanted to, you know use my job, or my career to, that seemed like a much more worthwhile cause to me than, working on problems, that affect, humanity and living things. So that's one way that I got into what I'm doing. But another way is I've, always been sort of inspired by the natural world. So growing up in Seattle, United States, there's this very large mountain that's, you can see from the city, called Mount Rainier. And, Mount Rainier is covered in glaciers. It's a big volcano. Um, and there's, lots of climbing and skiing on it. And, um, it's, one of those things where, not many people go do it in the world, or in Seattle, but there's quite a number of people who go do it in Seattle. So as a kid, it's just, oh, this is amazing. And, when I was growing up, I have a, pretty clear memory of, you know, going to the movies and watching Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, and, feeling that climate change was something that was going to melt the glaciers on Mount Rainier that I looked at every day in Seattle, or at least when it was not raining. It rains quite a bit in Seattle. And I thought, like, from like sort of, just very like a childhood perspective, like that was, just sort of devastating for me. And anyway, I think a lot, I having a lot to do with just being able to see Mount Rainier in Seattle. I just, really inspired by the beauty of nature, and also wanted to work to sort of protect that. And, I've got, became very interested and excited by lots of outdoor activities. So um, I guess as a kid, and I started skiing and rock climbing and mountain biking, and lots of mountain sports. And I was lucky enough to have a family that on vacation, we went to like a mountain town in Idaho where there's a ski resort. And I could spend we often spent summers there, and I could spend the summers mountain biking and climbing, and the winter skiing, when we would go sort of on holidays around Christmas time. And these have sort of been my passions outside of work, just trying to interact with natural beauty as much as possible. And, climb mountains, and go hiking and running, and just be outside as much as possible. And that's really what I like to do with my free time. I try to spend the weekends going camping and hiking as much as I can, and like in some sense, this is like that's part of the point of the work that I do. I want to work on something that can help make sure that the natural world flourishes, and climate change is a big threat to human life and also non-human life,
Mm-hmm.
and both of those things are very sacred to me, and that's why I like the idea of working on things to protect what I like to do. And yeah, that's one of the stories I sometimes tell is, so in the United States, the Colorado River is a big river that runs through the Rocky Mountains, and um, and out into the Sea of Cortez, which is sort of in Mexico. And there's this national park called the Grand Canyon, and it's a very deep canyon of the Colorado River. And this winter, just before we started fundraising, I spent 21 days camping and whitewater kayaking in on the Grand Canyon with 13 friends. And you know, that's like one of the experiences where it's like, well, what's the point of the work that I do? This is the point. I
Yeah.
I started at one dam and finished at another, and there was water scarcity, and like both of the dams, the reservoirs behind the dams were
Yeah.
almost completely empty. And drought in the American Southwest is where we have the most data for understanding the impact of climate change, and climate change is a huge factor there. And like this is like could draw a direct line of like this is an activity I really like to do, whitewater kayaking, and it's directly threatened. So that's sort of like a very personal thing that motivates me, as well as sort of the bigger societal things I mentioned at the beginning.
But thank you so much for sharing all of that. I think it's very precious to understand like what is the the flame and the drivers behind every entrepreneurs and especially even more in climate tech. So tell us a bit more about your different academic experience, because you don't have like that many professional experience prior to the launch of Brimstone, which is quite unique as well. You're still very young, but what did you learn along that way that you would not have if you had a different journey? I mean, what do you believe gave you an edge to start Brimstone?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for the question again. So just give you a brief history of my professional experience and academic experience. So I'm a chemist by training. I got a bachelor's degree in chemistry, and then I got a master's and PhD in environmental science and engineering. I guess there is some more detail there. So I originally, after my undergraduate degree, I wanted to work on, I wanted to work on big social or environmental problem, and I went into an MD PhD dual degree program, which is you get both a medical degree and a PhD, and it takes 9 years after your bachelor's degree, and it's a very long degree. Um, and went there because I really wanted to understand like the interactions between environmental problems and human health, and thought I could have this really diverse career. At least that's what I told myself. But really, I think I wanted to do the medical degree because I had concerns about job security, and when I went to medical school, I very quickly became very unmotivated and very uninterested in um, the work. And I think that one of the biggest things that I felt, at least in the United States, is that I was totally replaceable. As in, I think if I remember the statistics correctly, only 40% of the people who apply to medical school get into medical school, which means that if I had not gone to medical school, someone else who was, just as good as me would have taken my spot. And there's so many very highly qualified applicants who don't get in. Um, that the system would have just shuffled candidates around, and someone else would have taken my spot. So I really felt like, that career path just didn't feel like it could have a huge impact. And it was like that kind of realization that really drove me into, I think, where I'm going, where I then went to my PhD, and I wanted to work on something that people were not really working on. Because again, you know, those seems like the most important problems, because if there's problems that everyone wants to work on, they're going to get solved if they can get solved. But if there's problems that no one really wants to work on, they might not get solved unless you go work on them. So I I started with wastewater for applications in low-income countries, right? So in like the developing world where wastewater treatment is a big problem, this is not a very, this is not a very highly studied topic. There are not a lot of research dollars that go into this compared to, clean energy, for example. Um, and I really liked that it, allowed me to travel a lot, and I, got to, work on very interesting projects and see very, diverse parts of the world, and, also go do outdoor activities in those places, right? I was able to go climbing or skiing in, India, Nepal, and you know, New Zealand, and lots of other places through, this work. It was all very motivating. But then, our funding source, which was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they sort of were very clear that, if you develop a technology to solve a problem, someone needs to pay for that technology. And the best way to get someone to pay for it is to start a business, to sell it. And that made some sense to me, because I couldn't figure out how else people could pay for it, except for maybe raising taxes a lot, which seems fine, but I didn't really feel like I had the capacity to figure out how to get people to do that. So, um, and started. I thought about, starting a business with this wastewater treatment technology I was developing, and so I then started looking at other problems, because I sort of gave up on that. And I think that this is like, again, the idea for impact. Like if I can't, the technology could be great, but I want to have a high impact. So if no one can buy it, the technology will not work, right? So I then cycled through a few other technologies, first hydrogen and then cement, because hydrogen for fertilizer and then cement are, more areas that have large environmental implications,
Mm-hmm.
but not very many people are working on. And ultimately, I settled on cement because the economics seemed like they would work out really well. And I sort of came at this. I think I came at this from a very practical perspective, as in I want to work on a global environmental problem, and I think I know how, like, and starting a business seems like the most straightforward way. At least this is what I maybe learned from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Um, so how can I make sure that the business goals are actually aligned with the environmental goals? And with this current, with Brimstone and making cement, that's basically the business that I figured out where I could get the economic goals to align exactly with the greenhouse emissions goals. And that's what, and that's where I am today.
So before we go and we start to go into details about Brimstone, we'd like to zoom out and kind of get a sense of the overall context that you are surfing on with Brimstone. So let's try to get your overview on the cement and concrete landscape today. I mean, if you can share with us like some data, what is the global amount of concrete and cement produced annually? Maybe their contribution to the global GHG emission. And maybe if you can tell us like a little bit more like and uncover that, like, I mean, where are the emissions coming from in the production process? Because I think it's something that varies and quite important. And why is it so hard to decarbonize that industry according to so many people?
Yeah, great questions. So I'll start with some numbers. So cement, of course, is the binder in concrete, and concrete is the building material, as you know. Um, so here's some rough numbers, right? So there are 4 or 5 billion with a B tons of cement produced every year, and cement is about 10% of concrete, sometimes a bit higher, sometimes a bit lower. Um, so that means that there's about 40 to 50 billion with a B tons of concrete made every year. And that actually makes concrete the most consumed human-made material on the planet. So the only thing that is consumed more is, for industrial uses, is water, which is hard to argue is human-made. Um, but so it's a really huge thing. Um, and then it's responsible for about 5.5% of greenhouse gas emissions, or 7.5% of CO2 emissions. And let me be clear. So CO2 emissions represent about 75% of greenhouse gas emissions, or anthropogenic, or
Mm-hmm.
human caused greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of times people talk in CO2. I like to talk in greenhouse gas because that's the whole problem. So you may read other places that it's 7.5 or often rounded to 8% of CO2 emissions, which is true. But the more accurate picture is it's 5.5% of greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah.
To put that in perspective, cars are about 6.5% of greenhouse gas emissions, so a very similar number. If I remember right, planes are, I think they're 1% of greenhouse gas emissions. Um, and yeah, so those are just, that's some context. Maybe
Yeah.
planes are 2%. I forget now. Uh, anyway, that's some context of the scale. So cement is a very, very big problem. Um, so the next part is where the emissions come from. So cement is a pretty interesting problem, especially from a chemist perspective, because the CO2 emissions are not just from energy. So in almost all cases, CO2, which again is 75% of greenhouse gas emissions, typically comes from burning a fossil fuel. So natural gas, coal, oil, or petrol, gasoline, burning some fossil fuel that creates carbon dioxide emissions and go into the atmosphere. So that's almost all CO2 emissions are produced energy. And if therefore people say, well, if we can just figure out how to make clean energy at a low enough cost, we can replace all of those energy emissions. And that's great. That's a huge number of emissions. But cement also burns fossil fuels, but only about 40% of the CO2 emissions are a direct result of burning a fossil fuel. The majority of the emissions are something we call process emissions. So process emissions come from the actual chemistry of making the thing. So I'll do a brief chemistry lesson here. So cement today is made from a rock. Yeah, cement today is made from a rock called limestone. Limestone's the chemical formula is calcium carbonate, or CaCO3. And what that means is there's CO2 that's inside the rock, right? The rock looks very hard, so it's sort of hard to imagine a gas being part of the rock, but that's just how the chemistry is. The rock is, about 50% by mass CO2. And if you heat this rock up enough, the rock decomposes and releases the CO2. And then you're just left with calcium oxide. That's what's left over, or also called lime. And then calcium oxide is what you go on to turn into Portland cement. Or that's the normal type of cement, Portland cement. That's the industry jargon. And what that means is, even if you were to use 100% clean energy, 60% of the CO2 emissions would persist because you're still using that rock, which contains CO2 emissions. And that's also why people say it's a problem that's difficult to decarbonize. And I think what they really mean is you have to think about it differently, right? It's not just people are very used to thinking about energy problems, which makes sense, right? By far the biggest piece of the pie of greenhouse gas emissions is energy. So it makes sense that everyone has been thinking about energy for a long time. But now we have to look at the other emissions that are different than energy, and you have to think differently about, and that's cement. And that's why, people, I believe that's why people say it's difficult to decarbonize, really, because it's different.
So how is the traditional, cement and concrete industry structured today? Who are the main players and how is it organized? Can you give us an overview of the forces in place and why are they incentivized to find alternatives or not?
Yeah, that's another really good question. So the cement industry is, fairly consolidated. I forget the exact numbers, but I think it's, well, it depends if you include China or not. I tend to include China because China is part of the world and we all share one atmosphere. So if we want to decarbonize cement, then we better include China. But lots of these statistics don't include China. But there's I think there's 5 companies that, including China, control like 75% of the cement production in the world, or maybe it's 60%. So, there's Holcim, which is a European company that is, the biggest or second biggest in the world, depending on how you think about China. And then there's, I think, 3 major Chinese cement companies, and we Chinese building materials, and I forget. There's one other, and then there's several other large. There's a few other large companies. So Heidelberg, giant company. CRH is a newer but giant cement company, and Cemex is a Mexican company that has market dominance in the United States. And typically, these cement companies also own they own cement plants, and they also own concrete plants. So that's where they turn their cement into the building material. So they're pretty vertically integrated. They own everything from the original quarry where they quarry the limestone to make Portland cement. Then they also own the quarry where they quarry gravel and sand to make concrete, and they own the cement production facility and the concrete production facility. The one part that they don't own today is this ingredient called supplementary cementitious materials. So it's another necessary ingredient in cement. And that ingredient is actually the waste product of burning coal in either a coal-fired power plant or a blast furnace. So that's fly ash or slag. It's really amorphous silica with various amounts of calcium in it, and So anyway, these giant companies are fairly consolidated. They've been around for a really long time, and in general, what that does when you make the same product via the same process for a really long time is the scale increases, and the willingness to move quickly or change quickly decreases, which all makes sense, right? So these companies, they're all trying to compete with each other on price because they have the same product. So their business model strategies to compete with each other. And the first thing you might do is you might say, well, there's not much major innovation that can happen on the production side, because we've really been doing it for the same way for a long time. So we're going to cut the budget of our R&D department so that we can save some money, and make cement for cheaper, and therefore compete on price. And then also all of these companies are also very, very resistant to, or they're very not incentivized to change very much because they have a very comfortable market position. They're huge. They're all tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue every year. And why the risk of doing something new is huge because they're already doing so well. So and then the other issue is with scale, right? So you can always achieve lower production prices by going bigger. And if you can be very smart with your business model, like all of these cement companies have been, and you can figure out how to optimize shipping and demand and supply and everything, then you can just build a giant plant that cost $500 million or even $2 billion to build. And have enormous equipment that saves a lot of production cost, and therefore you can compete on price, and that's great for for the price of cement, but it's challenging for a startup to think about entering the market, because now if a startup wants to compete on price, or if he actually wants to directly compete with these companies, they have to figure out how to get $1 billion to build a plant at that scale or something like that. So it's a very interesting and very challenging market.
So if you step back and you look at that with your own experience in the market, and maybe you have the chance to look also at your competitors who are also trying to, in a way, to decarbonize the cement and concrete industry. So do you think there is a need for new regulation, or is it because the green premium that you guys are, the solution that you are able to put on the market is still too expensive to be, deployed at scale? What needs to happen to, in a way, accelerate this deployment at scale? And in which timeline do you think it's feasible, according to you?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So first I want to level set, right? So Um, Industrial processes to go through a global transition, history tells us that it takes at least 50 and probably more like 100 years for global transitions to happen. So there's lots of data on, energy transitions, for example, where we've, had wide-scale adoption of coal and oil and natural gas and hopefully now renewables, although the adoption is still fairly limited globally. And it just takes a really long time. And, like for example, Tesla, I think, Tesla started selling Tesla was founded, I think, in 1998, maybe 2002. Anyway, it's around the turn of the century. Not the old one, the most recent turn of the century. And uh, and before that, electric cars were being sold. Like for example, GM had an electric car that was being sold in the 1990s. But even now, what 25 years later, the electric cars is something like 1% market penetration, right? So these things that even in our heads we think are very fast, because we see a lot of headlines, it's all very exciting. They're not fast, right? Like these new transitions, solar was invented in um, 70s, and first company was maybe the early 2000s. I think first solar was 2001 or something. Um, and solar as a fraction of total energy supply, I think globally it's like 6%, maybe it's 11%. Either way, it's again been 25 years, and or it's something like 5 or 6%, or maybe at most 11% of total energy. It's a little better when you just look at electricity.
I mean, the thing is, like, we
But
don't
still,
have like those 60 years or 100 years in front of us to adopt that. So, why do you think
right.
it's
So
possible? I mean, do you still have a hope, or you just say, okay, let's go for the 60-year run, or before getting?
yeah, I never give up hope, because fixing it at some point will always be better than never fixing it, right? So it's never, people say like, oh, it's hopeless. It's never hopeless. It's just better and worse, you know. So, but I also want to be realistic. Okay, so what can change things? What can make things go
Yeah,
faster? And I think you asked about policy, and I think in order to make things go faster, we need policy, because the market is not fast enough without policy. Um, I think that, to be very clear, if your company sort of needs a carbon tax or needs policy to be adopted, it will not be adopted globally, because things are, even when they're just straight up cheaper, they're slow enough, right? Cheaper things still take 80 years to be fully adopted, but things that are more expensive, no one wants something that's more expensive, because it's more expensive. That sucks. But if if
yeah,
it's
it's this green premium problem. You know what I mean? Like what Bill Gates is
that's right.
mentioning everywhere, and like Chris Sacca is saying, you need to make something that's cheaper, sexier, and better for the consumer, and that's it. That's green or not, people will take it.
Exactly, and it's a hard problem, but we think our process can be cheaper. I think it clearly will be cheaper once it's at scale. So some things in policy we need help to get to scale quickly, and I think the money is there, right? We just raised a round, and which was certainly big enough to get to our next milestone, and when we get to that milestone, we'll raise another round, and I see a lot of pathways to get that capital. So I think that the money will be available, and then more money is always better. But I think policy can play a big role. So again, these big cement companies, they don't have much incentive to change. We need the government to provide that incentive to change. We need the government to make it necessary, so necessary for these companies to change, that they do something they usually wouldn't, which would be interact with the startup very, very early days, and most importantly, interact with the startup in a way that doesn't preclude that startup from interacting with other companies. Because if these big companies were to exclusively license technology from Brimstone or something, then that would could potentially kill Brimstone's ability to be able to work globally. Because we don't know what that cement company would want to do with the technology. So it's policy will play like is a necessary thing to do things at the speed we want. We saw policy be very effective. For companies like I mentioned previously, like Tesla and First Solar. So in California, there's a policy called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which essentially sets up a cap and trade system for fuel that put enough pressure on existing car companies that there was that they had to buy credits from Tesla, and it made room for Tesla in the market. Similar for First Solar in Germany, like First Solar entered the market in Germany and started building solar power plants in Germany because Germany had really strong policy to stop being dependent on coal and stop using coal, and that
But
worked really well to jumpstart for solar.
do you see any
Yeah.
incentivized, like, I mean, regulation already in place or upcoming? And maybe do you see a difference between the EU and North America, US, Canada, Mexico, or maybe China? With China, probably not, but
Yeah. Well, China's interesting. We'll talk about that later, but I right now I see some policy that I'm interested in, but for the most part, um, it's tackling what I believe to be the wrong problem, right? So most other companies that are trying to decarbonize cement are trying to put a new material to replace Portland cement with a different material. Um, and they need new policy in order to allow those new materials to be used in buildings. We make Portland cement, so we don't need to wait for that. Right, we can start going. So I think what we need is the policy that a lot of other companies also will need, but they don't need it until their material can actually be used. Right, so sort of the policy that we need is things similar to the low carbon fuel standard. Like we need a low carbon cement standard, which pushes cement industry um, pushes the cement industry to put our put our technology into the market. Or we need a basically we need heavy regulation to incentivize old plants to turn into new style plants.
okay.
And I don't mean direct replacement. I mean shutting one down and starting over. And I don't care who owns that plant, if it's Heidelberg or Holcim or whatever, as long as it's a process that doesn't make CO2 and also doesn't limit everybody else from using that process, right? So yeah, that's I mean, but and also just China. I actually think that China, it's complicated with China because the data is so scarce. But China does have a pretty good track record of getting things done pretty quickly. Like they've developed from a pretty low income country to a pretty high income country in a remarkably short amount of time. So I think China has the power to decarbonize the industry, and they've said that they're interested in it. And I think that they've if they put decarbonizing heavy industry into a 5-year plan, they'll do it.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
I mean, they might use the sticks, which sometimes, when the timeline is too short, policymakers, I mean, different degrees to use the stick, but I think definitely like a need for policies in place and like that really create constraints is more than necessary. So let's thank you for giving so much like context around like the industry that you're evolving on. So let's go deeper into Brimstone Energy now. I mean, you already covered a bit like the story behind the original gap that you identified. So in a way, can you just like reframe a little bit this initial gap that you identified with Brimstone? I mean, like why you launched it, and I mean, why did in a way Brimstone had to exist? Have to exist.
Yeah, so we developed a criteria for decarbonization, really in any industry, but we looked specifically at cement because that was a low something that people were not working on. And the criteria was threefold. So the first is, in order to decarbonize cement, there are three things that are necessary. The first is making the exact same materials as made before, and that's it. Like we talked about, that's a statement of time scale. The second is this process needs to be a lower cost process to make cement, or as we say, a rational, solely economic actor needs to choose the brimstone process over a conventional process. And then the third is, and this is a little bit more wonky, but the energy consumption for producing cement is about as low as it can get. It's really a pretty low energy consumption process when you're taking into account what is thermodynamically possible, right? What is allowed by the laws of physics. So it's unrealistic to think that like we might be able to use half as much energy or a third less energy, but there's no way we're going to use 60% less energy or 90% less energy. And right now, the cost of heat is such that heat is commonly 10 times cheaper than electricity. Right? And heat is never like it's never less than 50% cheaper than electricity. And the current process to make cement uses heat. So if we were to use, electricity or clean electricity, there's no world where we wouldn't be at least twice as expensive in terms of in or let's say we use half as much energy, which is probably the thermodynamic limit. There's no world that we wouldn't be, the exact same price, even if we used only the cheapest energy. And it turns out the cheapest energy is only available like 20% of the time because it's wind or solar. And therefore, like, okay, in order to be cheaper, so to follow rule two, we actually need to use heat because there's just no way that you can be cheaper without doing that.
Mhm.
So we decided that we need to use heat, and today, unfortunately, the cheapest source of heat is a fossil fuel. Hopefully, there are many technologies that are looking to change this, Antor Energy, Rondo Energy, or to name a couple. But there's, it, yeah, it's a hard problem. So we said, okay, well, if we're going to be cheaper, we're probably going to have to use heat, and therefore we may have to use a fossil fuel. And therefore, if we use a fossil fuel, we better be certain that our process is still near zero emissions, even with the fossil fuel. Because, and like really, this is like hedging. It's like we want to be a zero emissions technology, and if we're wrong and we're like way off, then we want a huge amount of room to still be better so that we're certain we're not making the world a worse place, right? Like my nightmare would be to develop a cheaper process that is more emissions intensive, you know? So, so we, um, so that was all, those are the three criteria: lower emissions, said very simply, same product, cheaper, lower emissions. And I looked at that for fertilizer and for cement and looked at the market, and I felt like this technology that I had for fertilizer, or sorry, excuse me, for cement had the best shot or the best chance of meeting those three criteria. And that's when I decided to start the company. And that's when I, met my co-founder and convinced him to join. And, we moved, started moving forward.
So on the product side, and you started to cover that a little bit. I mean, you guys have this bold statement like making cement carbon negative without changing the product or price. And I think this is pretty bold. And you already like covered a little bit, but like for non-technical listeners, if you could walk us through the production process and explain in detail the characteristics of your end product. I mean, how do you decarbonize that? I mean, this concrete that you are decarbonized, or cement that you decarbonized. I mean, how does it differ from this so-called Portland cement? And how is your pilot plant that you guys have work? I mean, what is the magic, the secret recipe that you guys have there?
Yeah, so we can talk about that. First, I want to address the boldness of it. So I agree that unfortunately, in the world of clean tech, it is bold. But in the world of like normal companies, it's not bold. It's actually maybe even weak. It's like if I came to you and I said I want to develop I have a new way to make a computer, but it's more expensive, then but it's a little better for the environment. You'd be like, okay, great. I don't care. Like people want cheaper computers. They don't want more expensive computers. So it's like what we see that statement of is like, hey, we understand that for something to be globally adopted, it's got to be
Mm-hmm.
cheaper, right? Or it's got to, at very least, it has to be the same price. So like when we say that, and it's really just a statement of the pillars that I just described. It's like, look, we recognize that we're very serious. We need to decarbonize. This is what we're building, and if it's not this, we don't think it's going to work. Okay, so that being said, how do we do that? Okay, so
For
um,
non-technical persons, huh? For
yeah,
non-scientists, huh?
yeah, Yeah, so we'll start with the cheaper part. So right now, in order to make cement, you mix Portland cement, which is what comes out of a cement plant, and supplementary cementitious materials. So as I mentioned a little earlier, supplementary cementitious materials are the waste product from a coal-fired power plant or making steel from a primary production of steel in a blast furnace um, or a basic oxygen furnace. And those two materials are globally getting scarce. And the reason they're getting scarce is because renewables are cheaper than coal for electricity. Also, where natural gas is available is cheaper than coal for electricity. Although, I think the Russian invading Ukraine has created some complexities around availability of natural gas. But regardless, where natural gas is available, coal plants are shutting down because natural gas is cheaper. Uh, and it's the same for steel. So we found that recycling steel using an electric arc furnace, which produces almost no slag, is much cheaper than using coal to make steel. So there's this whole story, and we've seen there's lots of data around it. Coal has been on the decline as a fraction of global energy production, and that means that the waste products from burning coal are also on the decline. Um, but the waste products for burning coal are an essential component of producing cement at the price points that we like to see, and also the strength and densities and everything. And we saw this is a huge opportunity. Like this is right now how the industry works is a very complicated supply chain where you have to go buy, you know, waste product from coal from several countries away and ship it in and have talk to 10 different suppliers, and it's a huge amount of cost. Whereas like, well, what if we could develop a process where we make both Portland cement and the supplementary cementitious material in the same product at the same place? That we would, eliminate all the supply chain complexities. So that's what we did. We developed this process that would make both, and because it makes both, it can be cheaper, and that's sort of how we can be cheaper. So the carbon negative point is okay. Well, we're going to I described these process emissions already. These are the emissions that come from the rock directly. We we start with a rock that does not have CO2 in it. So from the beginning, we eliminate 60% of the emissions. So the only emissions we have is from energy, if that energy were to be a fossil fuel. As I mentioned today, fossil fuels are the lowest cost form of energy. Fossil fuels for heat, and so let's assume we're using a fossil fuel for the sake of argument. Well, it also turns out that our process produces a waste product that permanently sequesters CO2, right? So if you can, basically the way to understand this is limestone has CO2 in it, it's a rock. And
Mm-hmm.
by heating limestone up, you can release the CO2 from the limestone. But then by taking the other product, the lime, and letting it sit at a cold temperature, it will reabsorb that CO2 and turn back into limestone. Well, this is true of both calcium and magnesium, as it turns out. And our product makes a lot of magnesium species as a waste product. And when we make magnesium waste product, that will reabsorb CO2 and turn into magnesium carbonate. Um, and that magnesium carbonate is permanently sequestered CO2. So to put it simply, we make a waste product that permanently absorbs and sequesters CO2.
Mm-hmm.
And it can do so much of it that even if we were to use a fossil fuel, we would still be net carbon negative for a typical rock.
So how do
And
you plan?
yeah,
Go ahead.
I was going to say the important thing here is this isn't something that we have to spend extra money to do because that would violate the cheaper problem, right? This is something that this happens passively. We make a waste product, and the waste product just sitting in air will react with CO2 and sequester it, and that's the I think the only way that carbon capture and storage can work globally.
So how do you plan to scale that technology? I mean, like now you have the pilot project. Like, I mean, how do you see yourself in 5 years? Like, what needs to happen to scale to the pilot project that you have? I mean, at a full scale.
Yeah. So it's our belief that, in order to serve the cement industry best, we need to fully de-risk the technology. As in, we need to make sure that if we were to try to sell our process to the conventional cement producers, it is just like equally de-risked as the conventional process. So in order to do that, we need to build a full-scale cement plant. Um, so that's the plan. So that's the first steps of the plan. We are going to build um, our pilot or demonstration plant that we're
Mm-hmm.
building now, and we will then turn that into a full-scale plant. Um, and um, the full-scale plant will um, produce cement at the normal scale and be fully de-risked. And then once we're there, we believe that our process will just be a more attractive economic process, and the cement companies will want to build cement plants using our process instead of the conventional process. And we can work with all of the cement companies worldwide to, at first, have new build cement plants be via our process, and then as the superior economics become clear, replace the old cement plants with our process.
Mm-hmm. So, can you tell us a bit more about like your competition today? I mean, in the EU, in the US, in terms of like, I mean, you mentioned that we're the only one doing what we do, and the rest is kind of like trying to figure it out. But is it true, or do you see like, I mean, what's the difference? I mean, how are you maybe better, or like, how do you compare your solution to the other solution available in the market in terms of efficiency and cost?
Yeah, so um, it's a good question, and I always, I think that I should preface this with saying that, of course, we don't know if we're right. Like every company has their own secrets and has their own technology, and I think that multiple companies trying to solve the problem is better for the world. Because just more shots on goal, you probably are going to make a goal. So I encourage lots of other people to try to think of clever ways to make cement and have startups. So, but our strategy is like we try to think of all the possible ways to make the product to meet the three pillars that I described, and this is the only process that we could figure out how to do that. For us, with how we thought about it, we looked at doing retrofitting cement plants with carbon capture and storage, and we couldn't figure out how to make that cheaper than the conventional process because you add a lot of cost with new equipment and more energy consumption, but you don't add any value that we could figure out. Similarly with new products, like there's lots of new products that new types of cement that could be cheaper, but we felt like it would take too long for regulation to happen. So that's another strategy that we don't do. And then um, the only way that we could figure out to be cheaper is to co-generate Portland cement and supplemental cementitious materials. Um, and no other company does that I know, and no other company is making Portland cement without the process emissions that I know. And I think those are key to us, and that's why we think our strategy is the best strategy.
So what's next for Brimstone? I mean, you guys now have like the bank and the financial power to go to the next step. So what's your roadmap for the next 12 to 24 months?
Yeah, so we're basically heads down trying to build our demonstration plant, our pilot plant. Um, we need and so the biggest thing is hiring, engineering, and building. So the biggest thing that we need engineers and scientists who are skilled chemical engineers that want to come build plants, and skilled scientists that want to do test cement or scale up unit operations, that have a passion for climate change, to come work with us and build this plant, because we need to show like, the big piece of risk that we have is we know the science works, we know the process works. Now do we know, like, can we actually build this at a cost that the modeling says we can build it at? If we can, then our process is going to be great, and if we can't, then it won't be. And we will know that by building this pilot plant.
So last question for this part, and I know we're running out of time, but what's your personal opinion on the climate crisis? I mean, are we doomed? What would you say to people who see is like demoralized by all of those terrible consequences that we see already today?
Yeah, I'm most concerned for people in low income countries and non-human living things. Um, I think that people in wealthy countries like myself, in general, we'll be able to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Now, there will certainly be problems, hurricanes, heat waves, fires. These will kill people, and that's, horrible, but it will not kill nearly as many people as in places where there's extreme poverty and they have just much less, resources to deal with. So that's what I'm most concerned about. And, doomed, I don't think that this is something that's going to make humans go extinct, right? I don't think that we're doomed in that sense. I think that we're in a lot of trouble, and water scarcity and rapidly changing availability of resources and natural disasters will be a big problem for a lot of people. But again, I think that's the wrong way. That's the wrong way to that attitude of, oh, we're doomed. It doesn't serve anything. In my view, it's like it's always better to solve the problem later than it is to never solve the problem. So let's all get to work and let's go solve the problem.
Let's do it. So how can
Yeah.
our listener base of expert founders, investors, listening to the show can help you? I mean, you mentioned that you guys are hiring. Anything else that you need help with, or we can contribute?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. It's really hiring, so if you know of interested chemical engineer, or you are an interested chemical engineer or scientist or something adjacent, email us at that's info at brimstone.energy, or check us out on LinkedIn or our website, www.brimstone.energy. In terms of investors, we were freshly capitalized. We're very interested in new money and a year or more. So please reach out then. And then if anyone is interested in thinking about ways that they could use the product or buy the product, we're very interested in having those conversations. So also please send us an email. But yeah, thanks so much for asking.
So any question that I did not ask you that I should have for this first part of the show?
No, I think you did a very good job. Thank you.
Thanks. Do you have like 3 more minutes, or you're done?
Let's see. I do have a meeting. I just need to remind myself. Yeah, I have 3 minutes. But
Okay,
I
cool.
really can't be any later than that.
Thank you so much, Cody, for your time and your incredible insights on this. It's super exciting to see, exciting people like you putting all of your time and energy to change the cement and concrete industry. I think this is a fucking challenge, if I can use that term. So congratulations. Excited to follow you guys.
Yeah, thanks, Guillaume. I really appreciate you getting the word out there. It's very helpful. So yeah, thanks so much.
Hi, it's Guillaume again. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. As I said, do not hesitate to share an episode with a friend. Also, if you value the work we do for the climate tech ecosystem, here is how you can contribute to it. Today, I'm asking for your support and a donation or sponsorship to make the work of our self-funded team more viable. Even a small contribution means a lot to us. In any case, I will invite you to subscribe to our channels and visit our website startupbasecamp.org to discover more episodes like this one, and get your membership to access all our members' exclusive content. So remember, all of this is possible because of your support and donation, and we want you to be part of this collective movement against climate change. Let's keep in touch, and I hope you will enjoy our next show with us.